Welcome to week 1 of PLIN0006 Introduction to Language. This week we'll be delineating our subject of study. We'll be introducing the idea of knowledge of language, and we'll be asking exactly what it is that linguists do. So let's get right into it and first of all ask, what is linguistics? And if you go and look in a dictionary, you might find a definition like linguistics is the scientific study of language, which sounds great, but doesn't really tell us very much about exactly what linguists study and how they study it. So there are two further questions that we can ask. We can ask, well, what aspects of language exactly are linguists interested in, and what does it mean to study something scientifically? So let's go ahead and ask those questions. Well, what aspects of language are linguists interested in? Now, if you have a keen interest in 14th century English prose, you might be slightly disappointed, but linguists have a very narrow interest in language. They're interested in something that we will call knowledge of language, or KOL for short. Knowledge of language means, what is it that speakers know when they know a language? What is it that they have stored in their minds, in their long-term memory, that allows them to produce that language? And then, going on from this, we might of course ask how this knowledge is acquired. How are infants, babies, children able to learn the language of their environment so perfectly, even though they don't really have any premonition of what kind of language they're going to acquire? Any child in the world is able to acquire any language of the world with an equal chance of success. Then we might ask how that knowledge is put to use. That knowledge is not just stored in our mind, but of course we use it to speak, to interact with people, to externalize that knowledge as language, and also to comprehend the language that we find around ourselves. Now, knowledge of language being a property of the mind, and the mind being something that the brain does, we might ultimately also ask, how is language implemented in the brain on the level of neurons that fire at different times and that interact with one another? How can we study language scientifically? Well, to study something scientifically means using a set of established and agreed upon methodologies to try and come to grips with, to try and explain some phenomenon about the world. Now, it would be almighty ambitious to just go out there and say, well, you know, I'm going to come up with a grand theory of knowledge of language and I'm going to tell you all about it. So a much better way to go about is to pick individual phenomena about language and then try and come up with better generalizations about them over time. But the first thing that you will need is data. You need to know about the things you're trying to explain. For example, sentences that can be and that cannot be produced in a specific language. And you might want to try and explain why it is that certain sentences are ungrammatical and other sentences are grammatical. So you need to have some sort of observation. Observations generally come in two kinds. We have direct observations, which is where you can go out in the world and you can measure something directly. For instance, if I'm interested in how many yogurts are bought in Waitrose on the Brunswick Centre on a Friday, I can go there at shop opening time in the morning, stand in the yogurt aisle and count every time someone buys a yogurt until the close of store. And then I have my observation of how many people buy yogurts on that given Friday in Waitrose. That's not what we can do with language, unfortunately. Even though neuroimaging methods have advanced greatly in the last decade especially, we're quite far removed from having some sort of machine that we can put on people's head and see exactly what is happening down there as of yet. We're getting closer and closer to measuring what individual neurons and groups of neurons are doing, but we're far removed from having any sort of ability to really image the mind, even if we're getting closer to imaging the brain every day. So we have to rely instead of indirect observations. We have to rely on the speech that people produce and things such as speech errors. For example, a few seconds ago, I said off instead of on and then corrected myself a little further on, which can tell us quite a lot about the processes that are happening in my mind as I speak. For example, there's a process that is monitoring what you say, and that helps you to correct things at a time. But also, I made a mistake where I switched one preposition for another. It would have been much less likely that I would have switched a preposition for a noun, for example. So we can make indirect observations and draw from those inferences about the processes that are happening in the human mind. So indirect observations are really what linguists are dealing with most of the time. And to those we apply inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning means reasoning in the absence of having complete data and having complete certainty about what follows from what. So if you're solving a logic problem or a puzzle or a beginner's level Sudoku or a maths problem in school, then you know all the rules of the game and you know all the relevant values of the variables and how they can be manipulated. And so you can compute with absolute certainty in your school class that 3 plus 3 will equal 6. But that is not the case when we're reasoning in absence of knowing everything about something. And that is what we're confronted with here. No matter how many observations we make, and even if we were able to make direct observations about language, we could never observe the entirety of language at once, or the entirety of the range of sentences that a speaker could produce in a language. As we'll see shortly, in fact, the number of sentences we can produce in a language is infinite. So we can never have complete certainty in that sense. And we have to apply reasoning in spite of that and try and come up with good guesses, with probable explanations for things. Now that leads directly on to where science gets its name from, namely the scientific method. The scientific method, very essentially, works like this. You have some phenomenon that you're trying to explain. For example, how come that we can switch prepositions when we make speech errors, and we can say off instead of on, but we don't switch nouns and prepositions. For example, it is quite possible that I switch a preposition when I say something like I'm sitting on a chair, and I might instead say I'm sitting off a chair, but I would never switch that for something of a different word class. For example, a noun, I would never say I am sitting cat the chair. So that tells us something about the knowledge of language that I have and how it's all put together and processed. And in the coming weeks, in fact, you will have a good sense of exactly what is going on, explaining why I can say I'm sitting off the chair accidentally instead of sitting on the chair, but I'm much less likely to say I'm sitting cat the chair. So you make some guess about what is happening when you want to explain such a phenomenon. For example, that words have different word classes, that there is a distinction between things like prepositions and nouns. And then you can think, well, what else should be true if that is true? And you can go out in the world and you can check whether that is true. Now, if everything is good, then that's fine. You go back and you try and make a grander claim, a bigger guess, try and incorporate more data and explain more, and you go out and you check again until you hit that point where you find that your observations don't confirm your guess. And that's a good thing. In science, when your prediction isn't true, that's a good thing, because then you have learned something. Then you know that some explanation is not the right explanation. And then you can make a new guess. You make a different guess and you try again. And that is the scientific method, which is why I like to call it sometimes guess, check, try again. That's the scientific method as far as we're concerned. Another thing that we're often doing as linguists is we build and test models. As things get more complex, as our ideas grow about how language works, we're getting entire models of how things are interacting. And so we can build these models and then test whether these models actually produce anything like human language or whether they confirm to observations that we find in real life. So again, this is essentially a version of the scientific method of guessing, which is building the model, then of checking, which is testing the model, and then trying again, which means fixing the model where it doesn't quite work to make it work better. So what is knowledge of language? Well, language essentially has two types of features. They're features that are shared across all human languages. These are universal features, and they're features that are specific to individual languages. And with language-specific features, it turns out that they are well behaved. They vary across a set of definite parameters. For example, something that we will see shortly is that some languages are allowed to leave prepositions at the end of a sentence when they make a question, and other languages are not. It's an either-or decision that you can make. Whilst there are other universal features that cannot differ from language to language, every language in the world will conform to them. So when we want to study these features of language, when we want to study knowledge of language and what is universal about human language and what is language specific, and in terms of what is language specific, how things can vary and how they cannot vary, a very good thought experiment to entertain is what is sometimes called the Martian thought experiment. So let's have a look at this guy I'm sure you have come across before, Noam Chomsky, explaining what is sometimes referred to as the Martian thought experiment.
And also of why the apparent diversity is pretty superficial. So that if, say, a Martian was looking at humans the way that we look at, say, frogs, the Martian might conclude that there's fundamentally one language with minor deviations. And I think we're moving towards an understanding of how that might be the case, and it is pretty clear that it has to be the case.
So language, when you look at it from the perspective of a Martian scientist studying humankind and how they communicate, really looks quite similar, one language to the next. Differences aren't that grave. They have, yes, different words, and this language employs a couple of sounds here that language doesn't, but by and far, structurally, they're all surprisingly similar, and they vary in surprisingly few ways, as we shall see. So let's look at some of these universal and language-specific features of language. So the first universal feature of language that we were looking at is called discreteness. Discreteness is when you can divide something up into well-defined units. So, for example, sentences can be divided into discrete units like sounds and syllables and words and phrases. For example, take the string of letters, cats and dogs, and you can divide this into individual characters. So we have C, A, T, S, a space, an A, an N, a D, another space, a D, an O, a G, an S, etc. So these are discrete units. We have individual units that together make another unit. So here we have a word, and here we have a word, and here we have a word. So we can also have different levels of discreteness building on top of each other, which is something that we'll find a lot in our study of language. Now, the opposite to that would be something that is continuous or non-discrete. For example, the color spectrum is not discrete. There is a sense in which you can say that certain colors are made up of other primary colors, but it's not the case that when you look at something that is violet, you see the individual color components. Rather, colors vary on a continuous spectrum. You can go at an infinitely small speck and still have a difference between two things. There's no concrete division between the individual colors. They flow one into the other. That is very unlike language. There's no fine gradation, no infinite levels of gradation that get you the difference between words like pin and bin. It is either p or it is b. Now another universal feature that we'll encounter that is extremely important is infinite embedding. And I've mentioned earlier that the number of sentences in any human language is in fact infinite, and that has to do with this ability of infinite embedding. So infinite embedding means that sentences can be placed inside of larger sentences, which then can in turn be placed inside other sentences, and so on. So for example, if I start with the sentence, "The world is round," I can put that inside another larger sentence saying that Galileo said that the world is round, and I can put that into another sentence saying that Sue thinks that Galileo said that the world is round, and so on. Yet another universal feature of language is creativity. What do we mean by creativity? By creativity we mean that we can produce and understand and judge sentences that we have never heard before. For example, "The astronaut that landed on Mercury sang a song" is a sentence that I'm willing to bet you haven't heard before. Yet you understand perfectly well what that sentence means. And you also know that a sentence such as "Which planet did the astronaut that landed on sing a song?" is ungrammatical in English. Even though you have never heard that sentence before, you have an intuition straight away, perhaps even as a second language speaker, that that is not a good example of an English sentence. Even more so, we can make sentences that don't even make sense and you can understand. For example, the famous sentence, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously," doesn't inherently make much sense, doesn't have any inherently apparent meaning. But it is apparent to any English speaker that that sentence is a valid grammatical sentence of English. Whilst to compare a sentence such as "Furiously sleep ideas green colorless," consisting of exactly the same words, just scrambled around into a different word order, is not grammatical, even though it perhaps makes just as little sense as the sentence before. So we have this ability to understand, produce, and judge sentences that we have never come across before. We have creativity. Now, to compare this, let's look at a couple of language-specific features. For example, phonotactics. Phonotactics are the rules of how the sounds of a language can be combined, the permitted sequences of sound in a language. For example, in English, we're allowed to have the sequence SP but not PS. So we can have words like spin, but we can't have words like psin. Compare that, to example, to Greek. In Greek, both p and ps are valid sequences. So we can have words like spanaki, which means spinach, and we can have words like psychologia, which means psychology, starting with ps, that sequence that is illegal in English. And in fact, English has, of course, borrowed that word, psychologia, from Greek and just gone ahead and dropped the P because that is illegal in that position in English. Another language-specific feature is the order of words in a sentence, what we call word order. Word order are the permissible orderings of major word classes in a language. Major word classes are things such as subjects and verbs and objects. So English is what we sometimes call an SVO language, a subject, verb, object language. Whilst, for example, my native language, German, always has to have the verb as the second word of a sentence, something we call V2, the verb second. Languages can also differ in how much freedom they allow with word order. So we have some languages that have a fixed word order that require words to occur in a predefined order, and other languages that allow more leniency. So, for example, in English, declarative sentences must have the order subject, verb, object, or SVO, whilst in the Central Australian language, Warlberry, languages can occur much more freely. It's not quite anything goes, but they can be ordered much more freely in a sentence. So we'll have a quick look at a recording from a documentary documenting Mary Loughran's work with the Warlberry people in Central Australia, and she'll have something to say about the word order.
If there are universal features to human language, wouldn't that apply to all people everywhere, even ancient people like the Walbri? Their language has been closely studied. What ground plan do they follow?
I'm studying the language of the Walbri people of Central Australia. The Walbri people are the Aboriginal inhabitants of a very vast area of Central Australia.
Mary Loughran, field linguist, has been living with the Walbri for over a decade.
The Walbri language is a very interesting language. Like other Central Australian languages, it has probably been spoken in relative isolation from non-Australian languages, possibly up to 60,000 years. So it makes it very interesting for research for linguists who are interested in finding out about differences between languages, but probably more particularly interested in finding about what is common to human language.
The Walbri people were nomads until a short time ago. Now they cluster in the town of Yuendamu, where they have adopted many European ways. As nomads, they value things they can carry in their heads instead of on their backs, like language. Stories which can be told in paintings or in words. Here, the subtle use of language is highly prized. Jacamara's painting is the story of a whirlwind, a legend going back to prehistory in the time they call the dreaming. There is an unusual sign language version of Walbri for use in special situations.
No, nobody speaks primitive language. All languages are extremely sophisticated. All human language constitutes a very, very sophisticated system.
Walbri turns out to be an inflected word-ending language, like Greek or Latin.
That was one word which I just typed into the dictionary there. Walbri is typically a language that has very, very long words made up of many, many meaningful parts. Unlike English, Walbri doesn't rely on the order in which words come in a sentence to convey the sort of meaning that order conveys in English. What Walbri uses instead are little suffixes which go onto a given word and which indicates the role of that word. So, for example, to say the boy kicked the ball in Walbri, we would say something like Wurialo, Pakano, Japu Japu. Japu Japu is the word for ball. Wuria is the word for boy. But to indicate that the boy is the doer of the action, we have an extra little piece on it, which is lu. So we say Wurialo. And then we have the verb Pakano, and then we have Japu Japu. In Walbri, the exactly same message would come across if I changed the order of the words, for example, and said Wurialo, Pakano, Japu Japu. Or Japu Japu, Pakano, Wurialo. Or I could say Pakano, Wurialo, Japu Japu. However, it doesn't matter what order the words are in, exactly the same message will come across that I am saying the boy kicked the ball.
So, as you've seen in this little clip here, the Walbri language, instead of relying on word order, relies on little suffixes at the ends of words to tell you, as a listener, what role these words play in a sentence. Whether something is the subject, whether it is the verb or an action that is happening, or whether it's the undergoer of some action, the object. Whilst languages like English use the position in the sentence to communicate that information. Now, there's a little bit more that we can say about word order variance. So, for example, even within languages that you might be familiar with, we'll find some finer differences. For example, English allows, but does not require, preposition stranding. Preposition stranding means leaving a preposition behind, dangling at the end of a sentence when you form a question. So, for example, if we have a sentence asking about a pen with which you wrote a letter, then we'd usually ask, with which pen did you write this letter? Here you can see that with which is one unit that stands at the start of the sentence. But we can also strand the preposition in its canonical position at the end of a sentence, where you would find it in a declarative clause. Which pen did you write this letter with? I wrote this letter with my favorite pen. Right? So in a declarative clause, we would have one unit where what becomes the question word goes to the start of the sentence, but the preposition is left behind. Now compare this to another language like Portuguese, which does not allow preposition stranding. So in Portuguese, I can say something like "Com qual caneta hoje escrevo esta carta," with due apologies to all the Portuguese speakers out there. Something like "with which pen you wrote this letter," very similar to English, but I cannot leave the preposition behind. Saying something like "Qual caneta hoje escrevo esta carta com" is completely ungrammatical. That's what this little star means that we draw at the start of sentences in linguistics. It means that sentence is an example of a sentence that is ungrammatical. So we have seen that in English you have a fixed word order of SVO and you can strand prepositions, but in Portuguese, where you have the same fixed word order, you cannot strand prepositions, and suddenly sentences like the latter clause that we had here with the stranded preposition in Portuguese become ungrammatical. Another, perhaps quite obvious, example of something that differs from language to language is the meaning of individual words. So, for example, in English, the verb to be can express both permanent and temporary states. So we can say John is tall, which is something that is permanent about him. John is not going to shrink tomorrow, and neither is John going to sprout into a giant tomorrow, unless perhaps he is a future NBA player, but we visit him when he is still 11 years old. And we can say something like, John is here in the room. Florian is recording a video. That is something very temporary. Hopefully, sometime in the next 15 minutes, I will be done recording the video, and yet I can use the same word as for something that declares a more permanent state, such as John is tall. Now, this is not the same in every language. So, for example, in Spanish, a different verb is used to express permanent and temporary states. Namely, the verb ser is used to express permanent, and the verb estar is used to express temporary states. So I can say Juan es alto to say that Juan is tall, and I can say Juan está aquí to say Juan is here, but I cannot say Juan está alto, because that would imply that his being tall is somehow a process that's in flux, a temporary state that can be changed when it isn't. And likewise, I can't say Juan es aquí, because being somewhere, being in a specific location at any one time, is not a permanent state of an object. So here we have two verbs making this difference, where that difference does not matter in English. So to summarize what we've seen in this first video, we've been asking the question, what do we know when we know a language? And that is the fundamental question at the core of linguistics. What we're going to ask in the next 10 weeks, and what perhaps over the next 3 years you'll be exploring in much more depth, and quite possibly beyond that, if you get as fascinated by what you're doing as I did, then that is the question that you'll be grappling with. And of course, we've seen that we can break that question down into further, smaller questions. For example, what do we know about the sound structure of a language? Whether sequences like p, s are allowed in that language or not. What do we know about the syntax of a language? For example, whether my language has preposition stranding or not. And what do we know about the semantics, the meaning in a language? And so on, and so on. Whatever aspect there is to language, we can ask smaller and smaller questions about to get better and better ideas about them. Now, another important point that we've seen is that for every such question about the knowledge of language, or KOL, that we ask at linguists, we really ask two questions. We ask, is this knowledge universal? That is it common to the entire human species? Or is that a language-specific property? And perhaps if it is a language-specific property, we can also ask the question of what are the parameters? That is, what are the possibilities within which this variance can exist? So hopefully you now have a good first idea of what it is that we as linguists do and how we attack the greater question of what it is that we know when we know a language. In the second video this week, we'll be taking a little bit of a closer look at the role that knowledge of language plays within the human mind to try and delineate what part of the human mind it is that is relevant for language that we're interested in.